The conclusion is by far the most important aspect of a logical reasoning problem, if it's an argument-based problem. And I think that you can get so far just from understanding the conclusion precisely. Even if you don't understand the rest of the argument very well, it's hard to spot the flaw. If you really know what the conclusion is saying, you can actually eliminate so many wrong answers. And if you've seen some of my YouTube videos, I have a lesson on some of these aspects. Hypothetical conclusions, right? If a conclusion is saying, if I win the lottery, then I'll donate my money to charity. If I win the lottery, then I'll donate my money to charity. It's completely irrelevant whether or not I will actually win the lottery, right? You won't weaken my argument by saying it's impossible for you to be sure that you'll win the lottery. That doesn't matter, right? Because if the conclusion is based on a hypothetical, we're going to pretend like that hypothetical part, the if part of that conclusion, is true. And do you see this point here? I put in quotes, that view is wrong. That refers to an argument where the conclusion of the argument is rejecting someone else's view. And a lot of times when people recognize that, it's a pretty easy conclusion to spot. But a lot of times when people recognize that, if you ask them, okay, so what's the conclusion of the argument? They'll just say, oh, the researcher's view is wrong. But actually, in a very important sense, that's not the conclusion, because that doesn't contain any substance, right? Do you take the time to actually translate what it means for that view to be wrong? And the middle point here, we'll take a look at an example, by the way, of all of these right after. The middle point about avoiding over-concluding, that refers to the idea of just making sure that you don't take what the conclusion actually said too far, right? If the conclusion says there are significant risks to invading our neighboring country, that's not the same as saying we shouldn't do it, right? If the conclusion says that Fabric Soft is the most effective softener available, that's not saying we should use it, right? That's not saying it's worthwhile, it's worth the cost. And so small things like that, if you've been studying for the test, you've probably recognized that they can make or break whether you get the question right or wrong. So I think it bears emphasizing that this is by far something that you want to improve your ability to do. All right. Now, just as an example, I have a small argument here. Go ahead and take 10 seconds to read through this. So you see at the end, this belief is false, right? What's the conclusion of this argument? This belief is false? Actually, in a very important sense, I would say that's not the conclusion. At least that's not enough, right? The actual conclusion, the way that I want to understand this, is effective online teaching does not require the instructor's face on screen. And you can rephrase that if you want. You don't need to be on screen to teach online effectively, right? That's actually what the conclusion is. And if this were a real problem, they would follow this up with evidence for why that belief is false. But you actually want to make sure you stop and translate that before you read the rest of what's about to come up. Someone who does that is just on average going to do a lot better in logical reasoning than someone who just keeps reading, who just thinks of the conclusion as, okay, so that belief in the beginning is false, right? If they don't take the time to actually translate it, they're not getting all that they can or should out of reading the stimulus. Now, let's think about that conclusion, though. Online teaching, effective online teaching, does not require you to be on screen. Does that mean that being on screen is not better than not being on screen? Not quite, right? So this conclusion here, it's not saying that having your face on screen is just the same as not having your face on screen, right? It's just saying you don't need it to teach effectively. So if you're doing a weekend question and there's an answer here that says, that tries to make the point that instructors who show their face on screen get a lot better results on standardized tests, on their students' standardized test scores, on their achievement test scores, that they basically produce better results than teachers who don't show their face on screen. Who cares? That's not relevant to what this argument is saying. And yet I know through experience that a lot of students would find that kind of answer tempting. They'll be thinking, wow, if showing your face on screen is actually a lot better, then, maybe this argument isn't as good. But someone who's very precise about understanding what the conclusion means will immediately know, who cares? That's not relevant. All right. And so really getting good at seeing these distinctions and being precise about the kinds of relationships the conclusion is talking about, that's how you go faster. All right.